Welcome back to Emma's Stories, where every tale is a heartbeat and every heartbeat tells a story of love. Today, the rainy streets of Seattle unfold before us, a city where the clouds hang low and the rain whispers truths to those who stand still. This is the story of Claire Thompson, a 32-year-old romance novelist whose world feels like it's slipping away. She stands by her apartment window, the glass streaked with water, her hazel eyes tracing each drop as it falls. I wrote love like it was eternal, she thinks, her voice silent but heavy in her mind. But maybe am the fool who believed it. Seattle wraps itself in a shroud of mist, its streets slick with rain under the glow of street lamps. The air smells of wet earth and distant coffee, a scent that once comforted Claire but now presses against her chest. She lives alone now in a small space overlooking Puget Sound, where the waves murmur beneath the storm's song. Her light brown hair falls loose, framing a face shadowed by doubt, and her hands clutch a pen that hasn't moved in days. The rain used to sing to me, she muses, staring out at the gray. Now it just drowns my silence. She wrote novels about soulmates, about hearts finding each other through chaos, but those stories feel distant, like echoes from someone she used to be. Claire has always carried a fragile hope, a belief that love could be as real as the pages she filled. Her apartment is a nest of memories, books stacked high, manuscripts curling at the edges, and mugs of tea left cold on the table. She poured her dreams into her work, crafting tales where love conquered all, where the rain was a backdrop to kisses and promises. But now, that faith wavers. Ethan Carter, her fiancé, was her proof. The man who made her believe her stories could breathe. He filled her days with warmth, his crooked smile a light in Seattle's endless gray. I thought he saw me, she thinks, her fingers tightening around the pen. Really saw me, not just the words I wrote. Now has gone, and the rain carries a different weight. Claire stands by the window, her reflection faint against the glass, and feels the ache of his absence. I wrote him as my hero, she tells herself, but heroes don't leave you broken. The betrayal lingers, a wound she can't name yet, and it pulls her inward, to a place where she questions everything. She wonders if she's worth loving, if the stories she spun were lies she told herself to feel whole. I'm a novelist without a plot, she thinks, her gaze lost in the rain. A woman who thought she knew love, but only knew its shadow. This story begins in that quiet pain, in the moments when Claire feels smallest. She don't know how to move forward, how to write again, when her heart is a blank page. The rain falls harder, tapping against the window, and she presses her hand to the cool glass, as if it could hold her together. I used to think the rain was my friend, she muses, a partner in my dreams, but now it feels like it's washing me away. Seattle stretches out beyond her, a city of whispers and secrets, and she stands alone, caught between who she was and who she might become. Claire's world is unraveling thread by thread, and she can't see the end. She wrote of love that lasted, of hearts that stayed true, but her own story has faltered. Ethan's departure left her hollow, a shell of the woman who danced in the rain with him, who believed his promises. I thought I was enough, she thinks, her voice trembling in her mind, but maybe I'm not. The rain keeps falling, steady and unyielding, and she wonders if it will ever stop, if she'll ever find her way back to the light. This is where her journey starts, in the quiet of a rainy night, with a heart that doubts its own worth. Claire Thompson is more than her novels, more than the pain she carries, though she can't see it yet. The rain outside is a mirror to her soul, reflecting the storm within, and somewhere in its rhythm, a new chapter waits. She stands by the window, lost in thought, whispering to herself, I'm fading, but maybe there's still a story left in me. 3 years ago, Claire Thompson's life glowed with a warmth she thought would never fade. Seattle rain fell softly then, a gentle hum against the windows of her favorite coffee shop, a small haven where she wrote her stories. She sat alone one afternoon, her pen scratching across a notebook, lost in a world of her own making. The door opened, and Ethan Carter walked in, his dark hair damp from the drizzle, his crooked smile cutting through the gray. He paused by her table, his brown eyes catching hers. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice smooth and easy. Claire nodded, her heart skipping, and thought, "He looks like someone I could write about." Ethan slipped into her days like rain into the earth, steady and sure. He was charming, a businessman with dreams as big as the city, and he brought a light she hadn't known she needed. They talked that day until the coffee grew cold, his laughter weaving into her thoughts. "I felt invincible with him," she recalls, her mind drifting back, like the rain couldn't touch us. He'd sit across from her in her apartment, watching her write, and say, "You're my muse, Claire, you know that?" She'd blush, thinking, "He sees me, really sees me, and I've never felt so alive." One evening, rain swept through Seattle, sudden and wild, as they left a quiet diner. Claire laughed, tugging her coat close, her shoes splashing in puddles. Ethan grabbed her hand, stopping her under a street lamp. "Wait," he said, pulling a red umbrella from his bag. He held it over her, stepping close, his breath warm against the chill. "You're my world, Claire," he whispered, "and I'll never let you fade." His lips found hers, soft and certain, and time melted away. The rain tapped above them, a rhythm to their kiss, and she thought, "This is what love feels like, a story I'll never tire of writing." Her heart swelled, certain she'd found her forever. Their love grew in tender scenes, each one a thread in Claire's tapestry of joy. One night he took her to an empty street, the rain a fine mist around them. "Dance with me," he said, pulling her into his arms. They twirled, her giggles mixing with the splash of their steps, the street lamp casting golden light over them. "You're my best adventure," he murmured, holding her tight, and she pressed her face to his chest, thinking, "I could stay here forever, wrapped in him." Another time by Puget Sound the clouds parted, just enough to let the water shimmer. He knelt, a simple silver ring with a sapphire in his hand. "I don't have the world to give," he said, "but I'll give you mine." Claire said yes, her voice trembling, and thought, "He's my home, my whole story." Those days were a golden blur, a chapter she never wanted to end. Ethan filled her apartment with life, sprawling on her couch as she read him her drafts. He'd tease her about the romantic parts, then pull her close, whispering, "I love you anyway, Claire." She wove him into her novels, a hero flawed but true, someone who'd brave storms for her. "I thought he was my proof," she recalls, "that love could be real, not just ink on a page." They saved for a house, a little place with a porch where they'd listen to the rain, and she'd smile imagining them there, old and gray, still holding hands. Claire lived in those moments, every one a treasure. He'd bring takeout after long days, and they'd eat by candlelight, the rain a soft backdrop. "You make everything better," he'd say, his eyes warm, and she'd think, "I'm enough for him, I really am." Her novels flourished, modest sales that kept her going, and Ethan cheered her on, proud of every word. They were a team, building a life stitch by stitch, and she believed it was unbreakable. The red umbrella hung by her door, a symbol of his care, and the sapphire ring stayed on her finger, a vow she held close. "I thought we'd last," she muses, her mind soft with memory, "that he'd always look at me like I was his everything." Ethan was her muse, her anchor, the man who turned rain into music. She'd write by her window, smiling as he slept nearby, his presence a comfort. "I felt so safe," she thinks, "like nothing could pull us apart." They'd walk the city hand in hand, his laughter blending with the rain's song, and she'd dream of their future, a life painted in love. He'd kiss her forehead, saying, "You're my heart, Claire," and she'd whisper back. And she believed every promise, every glance, her heart open wide. "This is what I wrote for," she recalls, "a love that felt eternal, a story I thought would never end." One stormy night, Claire Thompson's world began to crack. Rain lashed against her Seattle apartment, a restless roar that shook the windows, louder than the quiet she'd grown used to with Ethan by her side. She sat on the sofa, a blanket loose around her shoulders, waiting for him to come home. He'd texted about a late meeting, promising dinner, so she stayed up, her latest manuscript untouched beside her. The clock crept past 10, the rain a relentless drumbeat, and she felt a flicker of unease. Ethan's phone lay on the coffee table, forgotten that morning, and it buzzed once, sharp and sudden. Claire glanced at it, expecting a work note, but the words on the screen stole her breath. "Meet me tomorrow, babe. Don't tell her." Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, her hazel eyes wide with dread. "I don't want to know," she thought, "but I have to." Ethan never locked it, a trust she'd cherished, and now she swiped it open, her heart pounding. Messages spilled out, a thread with a name she didn't recognize. Lisa. The words were a punch, flirty and close, calling him darling, planning nights away. Ethan's replies mirrored them, warm and secret, promising time he'd never given her. I gave him my heart, she thought, her vision blurring, and he traded it for lies. Then she saw it, a line that stopped her cold. Sent the $50K to the account, should cover things. Lisa's reply, "Good, can't wait to celebrate. $50,000, their savings, the future they'd dreamed of, gone." Claire dropped the phone, her chest tight, and pressed her hands to her face. Nothing now, she thought, just a page he tore out and threw away. The rain hammered outside, a mirror to the chaos within, and she sat there, frozen, until the door opened. Ethan walked in, rain dripping from his jacket, his crooked smile faint as he held up a bag of takeout. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic was brutal." She didn't move, her eyes locked on him, red and raw. "Who's Lisa?" she asked, her voice shaking, barely audible over the storm. His smile faded, his face paling as he set the bag down. "What are you talking about?" he said, but the stutter in his voice gave him away. She stood, holding the phone out, the screen glowing with truth. "This, Ethan," she said, louder now. "Who is she, and why are you sending her our money?" He stared at her, then slumped against the wall, running a hand through his wet hair. "It's not what you think," he began, but she cut him off. "Stop lying," she snapped, tears spilling over. "Tell me the truth." He sighed, his eyes cold, and the words came like a blade. "Fine," he said. "Yes. There's Elisa. I've been seeing her for months, and the money, I needed it for a project that tanked. I had to cover it, Claire. I needed more than you could give." His voice was flat, final, and it broke something inside her. Claire's legs wobbled and she gripped the sofa, her mind reeling. "I thought I was enough," she thought, "but I was just a shadow he stepped over." "You needed more," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Our savings, Ethan. Our house, our life." He looked away, his silence a wall between them. "Do you even love me?" she asked, her tears hot against her skin. He didn't answer. His gaze fixed on the floor, and she felt the weight of his betrayal crush her. "You promised me your world," she said, her voice rising. "But you gave it to her. I trusted you, and you threw me away." He opened his mouth, then closed it, offering nothing but the rain's roar. "I'm done," she said, grabbing her coat from the hook. Ethan stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Claire, wait," he said, but she pulled back, her eyes blazing. "Don't touch me," she hissed, and he froze. She walked out, the red umbrella untouched by the door, a relic of a love that never was. The rain swallowed her, cold and sharp, soaking her as she stumbled through the streets. Her shoes sank into puddles, her hair clung to her face, and she thought, "I'm not even a ghost to him, just a mistake he erased." The sapphire ring burned on her finger, a lie she couldn't bear, and she twisted it off, clutching it in her fist. She stopped under a flickering street lamp, the rain pooling around her, and sobbed, her cries lost in the storm. "I thought he saw me," she thought, "really saw me, but I was nothing he wanted to keep." Every memory flashed, the kisses, the dances, the quiet nights, all ashes now. The rain poured, icy and unforgiving, and she hugged herself, trembling. I poured everything into him, she mused, and he drained me dry. The street lamp buzzed, casting jagged light, and she wondered how she'd missed the cracks, how she'd believed in a man who'd never truly been hers. Claire stood there, the city a blur, her heart a hollow shell. The love she'd written, the life she'd built, it was gone, washed away in a flood of deceit. Unlovable, she thought, a story no one wants to read. The rain kept falling, endless and cruel, and she felt it seep into her bones, a weight she couldn't shake. She was alone, betrayed, a woman who'd given her all and gotten nothing back. The night stretched on, dark and wet, and she whispered to herself, "I don't know who I am without him, but I can't stay to find out." Days after Ethan's betrayal, Claire Thompson drifted through Seattle's rain-soaked streets, a shadow of the woman she'd been. The rain fell in a steady curtain, cold against her skin, and she wandered without purpose, her hazel eyes hollow. "I'm a story with no ending," she thought, her coat heavy with water, a page torn out and left to rot. She found herself outside the Driftwood, a small bar tucked on a quiet corner, its windows glowing through the mist. The name felt right, a piece of wreckage like her, and she stepped inside, seeking shelter from more than just the storm. A sound greeted her, a piano's notes rising soft and clear, and it stopped her cold, a thread of light in her darkness. The bar was sparse, a few souls scattered at tables, their murmurs lost beneath the music. In the corner, a man played an old upright piano, his fingers weaving a melody that pierced her chest. It was sad, alive, an echo of the rain outside, and Claire stood by the door, water dripping from her hair, watching him. He was about 35, with tousled black hair and eyes that held quiet depths, focused on the keys as if they were his lifeline. She moved to the bar, sinking onto a stool, and ordered a coffee, her voice a whisper. The bartender slid it to her, and she wrapped her hands around the mug, the warmth a faint comfort. His notes felt like they knew me, she thought, like they saw the pieces I'd hidden. The song ended, and the man looked up, his gaze finding hers across the dim room. He stood, crossing to her with a gentle stride, and leaned against the bar. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice low and kind, cutting through the rain's patter. Claire nodded, her lips barely moving. "You could say that," she said, honest but guarded. Ryan," he offered, his name a small bridge. "Ryan Mitchell, that was my song." She glanced at him, a flicker of something stirring. "It was beautiful," she said. "Sad, but beautiful." He smiled faintly, studying her. "You look like you know sad," he said, and she thought, he sees me, not just the shell I've become. They talked then, words flowing like the rain outside. Ryan was a pianist, he told her, once a name in bright halls, now a quiet soul in Seattle's shadows. "I play to feel," he said, his eyes distant. "It keeps me here." "What about you?" Claire paused, then let it spill. "I write romance novels," she said, "but they're lies I don't believe anymore." He tilted his head, his gaze soft. "You're not invisible, Claire," he said. "I see you, even through the rain." His words hit her, a jolt to her bruised heart, and she thought, maybe I'm not unlovable, maybe I just needed a different song. They sat there, the piano silent, and she felt a crack in her walls, light seeping through. Weeks passed, and Claire returned to the Driftwood, drawn by Ryan's music and the way he listened. One night, he took her to a rooftop above the bar, rain misting around them as the city sprawled below. "Sit with me," he said, and they did, the bench damp under her. "Listen to the rain," he urged, closing his eyes. "It's a rhythm, a story," she tried, tilting her head, and heard it, a pulse that felt alive. "He looks at me like I'm worth something," she thought, and I almost believe him. Ryan's shoulder brushed hers, and he said, "You're not broken, Claire. You're a song I can't stop hearing." Her breath caught, his voice a lifeline, and she mused, "He's stitching me back together, note." Another evening, he invited her to the piano. The bar was hushed, Rain a murmur outside, and he played a piece he'd written for her, tender and bright. His hands moved with care, and he guided her fingers to the keys. "Play with me," he said, his touch gentle. She pressed down, clumsy but real, and he smiled. "Rain's not just pain," he said, close to her ear. "It's where we start again." Claire looked at him, his face warm in the lamp's glow, and thought, I was invisible until he saw me, really saw me. Her heart stirred, a fragile bloom, and she felt it. A chance to be whole. Their time grew into something steady, walks under a shared umbrella, rain tapping above as they talked. He spoke of his past, a love lost in Portland, and she shared Ethan's betrayal, her voice raw. Ryan listened, his eyes steady, and said, "You're more than what he took, Claire. You're everything he couldn't see," she thought. "He's not promising me the world, but he's giving me his, and it's enough." One night their hands brushed under the umbrella, and she didn't pull away, her pulse quickening. "Maybe I'm not just a ruin," she mused. "Maybe I'm a story he wants to read." Claire began to breathe again, her smiles tentative but growing. She'd watch Ryan play, his music wrapping around her, and think, he sees me as more than my cracks, and I feel alive. He'd catch her gaze, his eyes warm, and say, "You're my melody, Claire, the one I didn't know I needed." Her heart fluttered, and she thought, I thought I was unlovable, until he looked at me like I was his whole world. The rain outside became their thread, tying them closer, and she started to believe, not in grand tales, but in this, a quiet love unfolding under Seattle's sky. Claire Thompson's heart began to mend in the quiet spaces Ryan Mitchell carved for her. Seattle's rain fell softer now, a gentle rhythm to their evenings at the driftwood, where his music wrapped around her like a promise. She wrote again, small pieces about rain and renewal, her pen moving with a tentative hope. "I thought I was unlovable," she mused, watching him play, until he looked at me like I was his whole world. Ryan became her anchor, his presence a balm to the wounds Ethan left, and she felt herself leaning into him, trusting the light he offered. Each note, each glance pulled her closer, and she thought, maybe I'm not broken. Maybe I'm just a song he's helping me hear. One rainy afternoon, Claire stepped into Ryan's apartment above the bar, a cozy clutter of sheet music and worn furniture. He'd asked her to come, his voice warm with excitement. "I wrote something for you," he said, sitting at his piano by the window. Rain tapped the glass as he played, a melody of longing and grace that sank into her bones. She closed her eyes, letting it fill her, and thought, he sees me, all of me, and I feel whole again. When the song ended, she wandered the room, her fingers brushing his books, her heart light. Then she saw it, a photograph slipped into a copy of her first novel, tucked on a shelf. She pulled it free, and her world tilted. The picture showed Ryan and Ethan, arms around each other, laughing at a party 5 years ago. Ethan's crooked smile stabbed her, and Ryan, younger but unmistakable, stood beside him. Her hands shook, the date on the back a blur, and she thought, I trusted him, and he's another echo of my ruin. She turned, holding it up, her voice tight. "What is this, Ryan?" He froze at the piano, his eyes widening, and stood slow. "Claire," he said, soft and careful, "I can explain." She stepped back, her chest heaving. "Explain what?" she said. "That you knew Ethan, that you were friends." Her mind spun, a cold fear clawing at her. Ryan moved closer, his hands raised. "We were best friends," he said, "in Portland years ago. I came to Seattle after we fell out. I didn't know you'd be part of his life until later." Claire's throat closed, her thoughts racing. "Later," she said. "When?" He swallowed, his gaze dropping. "I met you at your first book signing," he said, 5 years back. You were talking about your book, and I couldn't look away. I loved you then, Claire, before he did, but he won you, and I stayed quiet." Her head reeled, that night a fog of strangers, and she thought, he knew me, and I was nothing to him then. "Why? You tell me? She asked, her voice rising, tears pricking her eyes. Ryan's face crumpled, and he stepped closer. Because I knew about Lisa, he said, his words heavy. I knew he was cheating, and about the money he took. I saw it all, the lies, the late nights. And stop him. Claire's legs buckled, and she gripped a chair, the photo creasing in her fist. You knew, she whispered, and you let me break? He nodded, his eyes glistening. I was a coward, he said. I thought if I told you, I'd lose any chance to know you. When you walked into the bar, I saw a way to fix it, to help you heal. The room shrank, the rain a roar outside, and Claire shook her head, tears spilling. I thought you were my light, she thought, but you're part of the dark I escaped. You're no better than him, she said, her voice cracking. You watched me shatter and stayed silent. She turned, grabbing her coat, and stumbled to the door. Ryan followed, his voice breaking. Claire, please, he said. I should have told you. I was wrong, but what I feel now, it's real. You're my world now, not my regret. She paused, rain streaking the window, and thought, he's pleading, but I can't trust him. Not again. How can you see me, she said, turning to him, if you let me fall? Her eyes blazed, her heart a tangle of hurt. Ryan stepped closer, his face raw. Because I see you every day, he said, and I hate myself for not saving you then. You're everything I couldn't fight for. She shook her head, her thoughts a storm. I'm a fool again, she mused, chasing shadows in the rain. She flung the door open and ran, the cold biting her as she plunged into the downpour. Ryan chased her, his voice cutting through the storm. Claire, wait, he shouted, rain soaking him. I'll stop him because I was scared I'd lose you forever. Sorry, I'll prove I'm not him. She stopped under a street lamp, water streaming down her face, and turned, her tears lost in the rain. He stood there drenched, his chest heaving, and she thought, I want to believe him, but I'm so afraid. You knew, she said, her voice shaking, and you let me bleed. How do I trust you? Ryan closed the gap, his eyes locked on hers. You don't have to now, he said, his voice steady. But I'll spend every day showing you I'm here, that you're my melody, not my mistake. The rain fell harder, a veil around them, and Claire felt her resolve waver, his words a pull she couldn't name. She stared at him, the lamp's light jagged on his face, and thought, I thought he was my healing, but he's tied to my pain. Her heart ached, torn between the man who'd mended her and the truth that broke her again. Ryan's gaze held hers, open and pleading, and she felt the weight of his confession, a wound she didn't know how to heal. The rain pounded, blurring them, and she whispered to herself, I'm lost again, a story I can't finish. She turned away, her steps heavy, leaving him under the lamp, the storm swallowing his figure as she faded into the night. Claire Thompson walked away from Ryan Mitchell into Seattle's rain, her heart a knot of doubt and ache. The storm raged around her, water soaking her coat, and she thought, I'm lost again, a story with no ending. Days passed in a blur, the rain a constant echo to her silence. She stayed in her apartment, the piano's memory haunting her, and wrestled with herself. I thought he was my light, she mused, staring at her blank pages. But he's tangled in my dark. Ryan's words lingered. You're my world now, not my regret. And she felt them pull at her, a thread she couldn't cut. I'm afraid, she thought, but I miss him, his music, his eyes. One evening, the rain softened, a gentle tap against her window, and Claire felt a shift. I can't keep running, she told herself, her pen trembling in her hand. I'm not just my pain, I'm more than what they took. She stood, pulling on her coat, and walked to the driftwood, her steps steady despite the storm in her chest. The bar was quiet, the air warm, and Ryan sat at the piano, playing a melody she knew, the one he'd written for her. His fingers paused as she entered, his eyes finding hers, wide with hope. I thought I'd lost you, he said, his voice soft, raw. Claire sat beside him, her breath shaky, and thought, he looks at me like I'm everything, and I want to believe it. I almost left, she said, her voice low. You knew Ethan, you knew what he did, and you stayed silent. It broke me, again. Ryan nodded, his hands still on the keys. I was wrong, he said. I was a coward then, too scared to fight for you. But you're not a mistake, Claire. You're my melody, the one I'll never stop playing. She looked at him, his face open, and thought, I was unlovable until he saw me, really saw me. Her heart softened, and she said, I don't want to be afraid anymore, Ryan. I want to trust, even if it's hard. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle, and said, I'll wait as long as it takes, because you're worth every note. They stepped outside, rain falling light and warm, and stood under the awning. Claire looked up at him, water glistening on his face, and thought, he's not perfect, but he's here, and that's enough. Ryan pulled her close, his arm steady, and said, You're not broken, Claire. You're my world, cracks and all. She pressed against him, her tears mixing with rain, and whispered, I thought I'd never be enough, but you make me feel like I am. They kissed, slow and real, the rain a soft song around them, and she thought, the rain, drowned me. It taught me to sing again. Years later, Claire and Ryan stood together under Seattle's sky, married now, their hands linked. A little girl with her hazel eyes danced between them, giggling as raindrops kissed her face. They lived in a small house with a porch, the one she'd once dreamed of, and listened to the rain each night. Ryan played piano for them, his melodies filling their home, and Claire wrote again. Stories of love that grew through I'm not broken anymore, she thought, watching him with their daughter. A story worth reading. The pain of Ethan faded, a shadow she'd outgrown, and she knew she'd found her truth, not in perfection, but in this. A life built on trust. Claire often stood by their window, rain streaking the glass, and reflected on her journey. I thought I was nothing, she mused, a woman no one could love, but he saw me when I couldn't see myself. Ryan would join her, his arm around her, and say, You're my heart, Claire, the song I'll always play. She'd smile, her hazel eyes bright, and think, he gave me back my voice, my worth. Their love wasn't grand or flawless, it was quiet, steady, a melody born from rain and redemption. The little girl would run to them, her laughter a note in their song, and Claire felt complete, a woman who'd fallen and risen again. Seattle's rain became their backdrop, a constant thread through their days. Claire no longer feared it, she embraced it, a reminder of where she'd been and what she'd found. I thought love was a fairy tale, she thought, but it's this, messy and real and more beautiful than I wrote. Ryan's music wove through their life, and she wrote beside him, her words a mirror to their bond. They'd sit on the porch, rain tapping above, and she'd lean into him thinking, I'm home, not in a place, but in him. Their daughter slept nearby, and Claire knew she'd tell her one day. Love, it's perfect. It's finding someone who sees your cracks and stays. This is The Whisper of the Rain, a tale of a woman who thought she was unlovable until someone looked at her like she was their world. Claire Thompson found her song, not in the past that broke her, but in the man who stayed, in the rain that healed her. She stood with Ryan, their hands clasped, and thought, I'm not fading, I'm alive, a story unfolding every day. Here at Emma's Stories we know love is about being flawless, it's about being seen, truly seen, and choosing to build from there. Claire's rain sang her back to life, and maybe yours can too.